Okay, well, welcome everyone to this week's Rough Cut seminar series. We've got an exciting seminar today. We have a slate for the whole semester lined out, so please go on montanaioe.org to see the rest of the seminars we have for the rest of the semester. Let's see, we're a week from Friday will be the first Friday of the month, so we'll have our first Friday happy hour. So a week from Friday over Bridger Brewing at 5 o'clock. I'll mention it again next week. Today we're very happy to have Andrew Wilcox here to talk to us. Andrew is an associate professor in the Department of Geosciences at University of Montana. He's been there since about 2007. Prior to that, he was at USGS, where he worked since he got his PhD at Colorado State. The other thing I should mention, he's the director of the Center for Riverine Science and Stream Renaturalization at U of M, also known as the River Center. And his research, I'm very interested in seeing his talk today. He studies why rivers are shaped the way they are, using both field measurements and modeling to look at sediment transport and stream structure, and then how that relates to ecosystems. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Okay. Thank you, Richard, and thanks for coming. It's nice to come over to Bozeman and chat about my work. Before I jump into this, just want to mention that this is the work of many collaborators. There have been a number of graduate and undergraduate students that have done theses based on some of the dam removals I'll talk about today. Also been working with some collaborators from USGS, and also recently been involved in a USGS John Wesley Powell Center synthesis group on dam removal, where folks who have been working on dam removals around the country have come together to try to figure out what we're learning more broadly from our individual dam removal studies to both inform future dam removals and what we're learning about river science in general. So in the talk today, I'll start out with a little bit of context on dam removals. Most of the time, I will be talking about my group's work on two dam removals, which are pictured here. The first one, Milltown Dam Removal here in Montana on the Clark Fork River near Missoula. And the second one, the Condit Dam Removal on the White Salmon River in Washington, pictured on the right. And then I'll wrap up with a little bit about what we've learned both from these dam removals that I'll be talking about here and from the Powell Center group in general. And just to point to a couple of the take-home messages that are conveyed in the title here. First is that dam removals provide great experiments for understanding how rivers respond to disturbances. When dams are removed, pulses of reservoir sediments are introduced into rivers, and dam removals provide an opportunity to learn about how rivers move sediment and how they recover from disturbances. These are also experiments in river restoration. How do rivers respond to river restoration? Secondly, rivers are resilient. One of the take-home messages from studying dam removals is that rivers recover quickly from these disturbances introduced by dam removals. In my talk today, I'm going to be focused on physical processes associated with dam removal. As Richard mentioned, I'm a geomorphologist. I study flow and sediment transport and channel change in rivers. There are a lot of interactions between physical processes and ecological processes in rivers. That's not the focus of my talk, but I'll be happy to try to answer questions about that since we are here at the Institute on Ecosystems, Rough Cut, after all. Okay, so some context. Here's a map of dam removals over the last century in the U.S. This was put together by American Rivers, and there have been over 1,000 dams removed in the U.S., and the green pins show those that were removed last year alone. So we can see many dam removals concentrated in the Midwest and in the northeastern U.S. If we look at this in terms of decade by decade dam removals, we can see there's been a big increase in dam removals in recent decades. And we might think that this is primarily because of changing environmental perspectives and concerns about river restoration, but it's really a function of the fact that dams are infrastructure. And there are a lot of old dams. Rivers move sediment. They fill up reservoirs with sediment. And dams have a certain lifespan. And managers have to make a decision when dams reach the end of their lifespan about what to do. There can be safety problems, liability problems. And in the vast majority of these dam removals, this was an economic decision where the costs of maintaining the dam and keeping it in place were greater than the cost of removing them. So yes, environmental concerns, but many of these are primarily driven by economic concerns. Okay, so stepping back to why we do this. There are costs with removing dams. The primary of those are the loss of the benefits that those dams brought in the first place, whether that's hydropower, flood control, navigation, et cetera. In some cases, especially where there are either large volumes of sediment stored or where contaminated sediments are present, there can be substantial costs to removing dams. And there can be a set of both upstream and downstream impacts that we'll talk a little bit about today. Okay, of course, benefits in terms of river restoration, reconnection of habitat, both for movement of biota and also for fluxes of sediment, water, nutrients, and wood in rivers. Also show a sequence of pictures here, both because it's a nice time series of how a river changes in response to dam removal, but also to make the point that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Dams are being removed in Europe as well for the same reasons. Aging dams, figuring out what to do about them. Okay, so the graph here shows a removal year on the x-axis from 1900 to 2020. The top graph shows dam height, where the line in the middle creates a somewhat arbitrary distinction between short dams and tall dams. So tall dams being those higher than 10 meters in height. And from this we can see that the vast majority of dams that have been removed are small dams. The bottom frames that in terms of the amount of reservoir sediment that is stored. So large versus small volume. Most of dam removals look like this. These are dams that are a few meters high. There may not be much sediment stored behind them. They may get removed without any science done, really, and with minimal impacts on the rivers as far as we know. Recently, however, we have started to remove some larger dams, and we've taken advantage of these dam removals to understand how rivers process sediment pulses, as I mentioned at the beginning. So here's a map showing both dams in the U.S. by state and also select dam removals that are summarized in this synthesis paper that has come out of the Powell Center efforts that's cited here at the bottom. And the light-colored circles are shorter dams. The darker red circles are taller dams concentrated in the Pacific Northwest. So I will at least briefly talk about all of these. We've got a pair of dam removals on tributaries to the Columbia River, Marmot Dam in Oregon and Condit Dam in Washington, Milltown here in Montana, and then 2 dams removed on the Elwha River. Okay, so from these large dam removals, we are developing a body of science to understand the coupling of upstream and downstream processes in dam removals. And on the right shows a schematic of a number of management-related concerns related to dam removal, whether those are incision upstream that may affect groundwater wells or bridge piers, non-native vegetation in former reservoirs, or downstream, what's going to happen in terms of turbidity impacts, aggradation, et cetera. These are all management concerns that come up whenever a large dam is being removed that science can help inform. So upstream, we typically want to know something about the erosion processes out of the reservoir in terms of how much sediment is being removed from the reservoir, the rate of that removal, how long the reservoir erosion lasts, how far upstream it goes. Does it infringe on upstream infrastructure such as bridge piers? What are the processes by which that erosion occurs? Is it nick point incision, landsliding, et cetera? And ultimately, how is that former reservoir, that lentic reach, evolving into a river? Downstream, we want to know what's going to happen to that sediment. How much will be transported and deposited? Where will the sediment go? What types of geomorphic environments will the sediment be deposited in? What are the physical effects? How long will those last? And what are the ecosystem effects? So one of the first places we started studying this, and the first dam removal project I was involved in, was Marta Dam on the Sandy River. This is a tributary to the Columbia, and Marta Dam was filled with sediment. This was removed for economic reasons. The utility decided to remove it. And a few things that were unique about this were that this was what we call a blow-and-go removal. So the dam was blown up, and the sediment was allowed to go downstream. There was no management of the sediment. So one of our first chances to study movement of a large volume of sediment down through a river. And we can look at a time lapse that was put together by the USGS. And this is going to show the breaching of the coffer dam. So typically when the dam is removed, the dam structure is taken out, and a coffer dam, a pile of dirt basically, is built to keep the reservoir in place so that the dam removal can happen in the dry. So this is the day of breaching. You can see that the river is doing its work quickly. Now we're moving overnight. And this was a dam removal where there had been a lot of numerical modeling and prediction that went into how quickly reservoir erosion would happen and where the sediment would go. On the side of the where the sediment would go equation, the numerical models worked pretty well. But the reservoir erosion happened much, much more quickly than anticipated here. By the next day, it's a river again. You might not even know that a reservoir was there. Okay, so moving on to other large dam removals in the Pacific Northwest. You may have heard about these in the news. So two large dams on the Elwha River, Elwha Dam and Glines Canyon Dam. These are the largest dam removals by many measures. Total sediment volume in the two reservoirs is over 20 million cubic meters. Glines Canyon Dam is 64 meters tall. Lots of anadromous fish species in these rivers. An interesting dam removal in terms of not only having a fluvial geomorphology element, but also a coastal geomorphology element as that 20 million cubic meters of sediment moves out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. There is an army of PhD scientists studying this dam removal in terms of geomorphology, ecology, et cetera, and papers starting to come out about that. I am not a member of that army, however, so I am not going to talk about Elwha other than just to bring it up as sort of the big dam removal that has happened recently. Okay, I am going to talk about Milltown and Condit, and we can look at dam removals in terms of a number of key measures that are listed here. And for all of these, except for grain size, we can think about the Elwha removals as being on the right side of this spectrum. The tallest dams, the largest sediment volumes, the largest cost. The Elwha removals were on the order of $300 million. But Milltown and Condit are notable as well by many of these measures. Condit is the second largest dam that's been removed. Milltown is the second largest in terms of sediment volume, also notable as we'll see because a lot of that sediment was contaminated. One of the primary factors that influences how a river responds to a dam removal is the grain size of the reservoir sediment. And we have finer sediment at Condit and coarser sand at Milltown. Marmots over here in the gravel range. Another important choice that managers have in removing dams is how to do it. I mentioned with Marmot that it was a blow-and-go removal where things happen quickly. Condit, as we'll also see, was a very rapid blow-and-go style removal. But in some cases, a dam removal might occur over a number of years as an effort to phase the sediment movement downstream over time to sort of meter out that sediment. And both Milltown and Elwha are multi-year removals, which tends to be correlated with higher cost. Okay, so starting with Milltown. As Richard mentioned, I got to the University of Montana in fall of 2007, and I had already been interested in dam removal. Milltown was slated for removal in spring of 2008, and I assumed there were already a lot of people that would be working on this because this was a big, high-profile dam removal. But there was really no one working on understanding the downstream geomorphic response because so much of the effort at Milltown was focused on the reservoir and on remediation of sediment contamination there. So 5.5 million cubic meters of sediment, and we can break that sediment into kind of 3 packages of sediment. First, the sediment on the Blackfoot arm. So one thing that's unique about Milltown is that it's at the confluence of 2 rivers, the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot River. So the Blackfoot is a confined river with uncontaminated sediment. On the Clark Fork, we kind of have 2 distinct packages of sediment. The lower Clark Fork arm, outlined in red there, was the hottest, most contaminated sediment. The sort of green shading there denotes the sort of focus of an arsenic plume that was moving into groundwater and was the primary motivation for this dam removal as a way to clean up that arsenic plume and the associated sediment. Upstream, we have the upper Clark Fork arm, which is also contaminated sediment, less so than in the lower Clark Fork arm. This is a vegetated floodplain that in some ways many people would not have thought of this as part of the reservoir sediment, but there's variable levels of contamination here. This is a big Superfund site. The focus of the Superfund remediation was sediment excavation in the lower Clark Fork arm. What we're interested in geomorphically is the river response both in the upper Clark Fork arm and in the Blackfoot and the erosion of these materials downstream and how those affect the downstream system. This is just a few kilometers upstream of Missoula. If you drive on I-90 towards Missoula, you have driven past the Milltown dam removal site. Okay, so our story at Milltown starts back at the turn of the last century in the upper Clark Fork watershed with mines in Butte and Anaconda, where management of tailings was not exactly cutting edge. And in 1908, about a year after Milltown Dam was built, there was a large flood event, 500-year recurrence interval type event that moved large volumes of mining-related sediments down through the Clark Fork system. And much of it was deposited in the Deer Lodge Valley and in Milltown Reservoir. So about a year after the dam was built, it lost most of its hydroelectric capacity and filled with sediment. So for a long time, it looked like this image of sort of a shallow wetlands area. Starting around 1980 was when the awareness of the arsenic contamination in the groundwater and the linkage of that arsenic to mines upstream started to come to the fore, work by Johnny Moore and Bill Lissner at triggering designation of the Clark Fork as a Superfund site, so the largest Superfund site in the country, from the mines in Butte all the way down to Milltown. And after decades of deliberation about what to do about it, they came to a choice to remove the sediment and the dam. Only part of the sediment, however, mentioned there was 5.5 million cubic meters of sediment, and the amount of money available in the Superfund agreement was enough to remove about a third of the sediment, leaving substantial reservoir sediment behind to potentially be eroded and moved downstream. Okay, so just walk through how this was done. This is what it looks like before the dam removal, and this is a phased removal over time. They first draw down the reservoir. The dam is still in place, but they're trying to expose sediments to facilitate sediment remediation. They built a rail line in there to ship the sediments out back upstream to Anaconda, the Opportunity Ponds remediation area, and the bypass channel on the far right is where they're going to route the river for a while during the dam removal. Okay, so dam removal moves forward over the winter and spring of 2008. As with Marmot, there's a coffer dam that will be breached to provide connectivity of the upstream and downstream parts of the river. And the Superfund remediation area is bermed off to prevent river erosion there, but there is certainly river erosion of sediments in these parts of the image and further upstream. Okay, so the coffer dam is breached. At Marmot, the breaching of the coffer dam, as we saw in the video, was a dramatic, rapid erosion type event. Milltown, it was a much more controlled, slow erosion event. Quite a bit of change by the next day, but standing up on the breach, standing up on the bluff above the river, watching the breach of the coffer dam on March 28th, it was not a lot happening sort of over the time scale of minutes to hours. More of a longer term adjustment here, in part because of this being a more controlled removal. And here's what it looks like a year later. Okay, so let's look a bit at what happened. One way we can think about system response and potential controls on river response in general, whether it's dam removal or not, is what does the hydrology look like? So let's first focus on the blue lines on this plot. These are river flows measured a few kilometers downstream of the dam in the years following the dam breach there in March 2008. So in the first 2 years immediately after the breach, we have two very similar hydrographs with recurrence intervals of about 3 years. So above average flows, not big events, but above average enough to do some geomorphic work. And then here, several years later in 2011, we have a larger flood, a 10 to 15 year recurrence interval. Now we can look at the red lines, which is the suspended sediment flux measured at that gauge downstream of the dam removal. And as we would expect, we see a large spike in suspended sediment flux immediately after the dam removal in that first year. So that's all the fine sediment, sort of the easy to erode stuff, coming out of the reservoir and moving downstream. In the following year, even though the peak flows are about the same magnitude, the suspended sediment flux has already gone way, way down. So we see a very big difference between sort of the flows and suspended sediment fluxes with time. One of the things that we try to do in studying geomorphic systems in general is to follow the sediment, to build a sediment budget. The amount of sediment moving through a system is the first thing we want to understand in terms of understanding how a system might be changing. So these suspended sediment fluxes are going to be part of that sediment budget. The second part is measurement of the bed load component of the sediment load. So the rocks rolling, sliding, hopping along the bed of the river as opposed to the sand and silt moving up in suspension. The suspended load was measured by USGS. The bed load was measured by my group, including my student James Johnson. So we went to Bridges with a truck and a big sampler, dropped that onto the bed of the river at different discharges, different sampling sites, and we get samples that look like this. And we develop what are called rating curves, which is basically a way of relating the discharge in a river to the bed load flux for different sites upstream and downstream of the dam removal. So we can put that information together to try and build a sediment budget, so a multi-year sediment budget of the amount of sediment that's come into Milltown Reservoir from both the Clark Fork and the Blackfoot arms of the reservoir, the amount moving out, and the change in storage, which is reservoir erosion. Okay, so of the original volume of sediment, which is 5.5 million cubic meters, 2.2 million cubic meters were excavated and moved out of the system as part of the Superfund remediation. We have our measurement of suspended and bed load fluxes coming into the reservoir. and then moving out of the reservoir. And we can put that together to estimate a volume that's eroded. So this is entirely based on measurement of fluxes, suspended and bedload flux. Okay, and we can look at that over time, and we see steps in terms of the amount of erosion that correlate with flows. So the first big step is those flows right after the dam removal in March 2008. There actually is some erosion before the dam that's associated with those drawdowns, but the steps get smaller with time as the system starts to re-equilibrate and stabilize. Another way we can look at the amount of erosion is through topographic change. So we are looking here at a LiDAR image that shows differencing of topography from before and after the dam breach, where the warmer colors indicate more erosion, and we see the Superfund remediation here. This is the upper Clark Fork arm of the reservoir. We're not showing scour in the lower Blackfoot. And using that differencing of digital elevation models, we can come up with an estimate during these 2 years of how much scour there was. And that's what it looks like on the ground. These kind of bare substrates are eroded areas. Now, one thing that's notable about this is that this far exceeds the amount that was predicted by sediment transport models. The sediment transport models essentially said that there would be basically no erosion in the upper Clark Fork arm. And that was significant from a public policy perspective because these are contaminated sediments. The managers were comfortable telling the public that, you know, we've got this under control, that none of the contaminants are going to move downstream. This is what our models say. But in fact, there was erosion of contaminated sediment downstream. We'll come back around in a few slides to what some of the data downstream in terms of contaminated transport looks like. Okay, so moving from what happened in the reservoir to looking downstream. Here's a map of the Clark Fork Basin, and we're going to zoom in on an area from the dam down to the confluence with the Bitterroot River. So the flows in the Clark Fork approximately double on the west side of Missoula where the Bitterroot River comes in. We can look at downstream transport both in terms of delineating different reaches. We have what we call a transport reach downstream of the dam. So this is a confined, relatively high gradient reach where sediment essentially is routed through without a lot of deposition. And then a response reach, lower gradient, less confined, an area where from geomorphic first principles we would expect more sediment deposition. Within those, we can also think about what parts of the channel bed would we expect to see sediment deposition. In pools or riffles, in the pore spaces of the gravel and cobble in the rivers, in the riverbed, on bars, out on floodplains as a result of overbank deposition, or out of the system. So by that we mean moving further downstream out of the reach that we've delineated here to where we're moving into a larger and larger river system where the signal of the Milltown sediments gets much more difficult to detect amidst the noise of a larger river system. Another dam is about 200 kilometers downstream of Thompson Falls. All right, so one of our study reaches was a couple kilometers downstream of the dam. You might expect you to see a lot of geomorphic response close to the dam just based on proximity. But like we mentioned, this is in a transport reach where there's a high transport capacity. These are repeat cross-sections. And the basic take-home message here is that there is essentially no geomorphic change in these cross-sections in this reach close to the dam. So we might have expected to see a little bit of deposition given the proximity to the dam, but essentially no change here. As we go further downstream to this more depositional reach, this is just west of Missoula between the Reserve Street Bridge and the Bitterroot confluence, if you know the area. we saw much greater deposition following the dam removal. So packages of sediment on the order of 1 meter thick depositing on bars, in side channels, and in pools in this reach of the river. Another of our predominant responses that we saw is infiltration of fine sediment into the pore spaces of the river. So the Clark Fork is a gravel cobble bed river. And even though we didn't see a lot of net elevation change in a lot of reaches of the river, we saw a lot of sediment showing up in the pore spaces, as you see here. So to study this, we wanted to understand something about the source of the sediment. Are the fine sediments that we're seeing in the pore spaces of the bed, are they contaminated? Are they Milltown sediments? How much vertical variability do we see? Do those fines infiltrate down to depth, or do they form sort of a seal towards the top of the bed? How long do they stick around? When subsequent floods come through, does the river get remobilized, or do those fines stay in the bed and kind of lock the bed into place? So we have a number of methods we use to study this. One is collecting bulk sediment samples. Another is collecting what we call freeze cores. Volume down, even though it's nice to hear a river flowing amidst the talk, just so I can talk through what's happening here. So freeze core, we are pounding stakes into the river, isolating a small part of the bed, and this contraption we're showing is designed both to inject liquid nitrogen into those stakes in the bed so that we essentially freeze a core of the sediment, and then it's on this tripod and come-along system that allows us to pull the core out of the bed of the river. And the point of this is to allow us to get a sample of the bed with both the coarse sediment and the fine sediment intact, and that's what it looks like when it comes out of there. So it's not easy to do in a coarse-bedded river like this, and we broke a lot of equipment, a lot of metal poles and so on trying to do this. But we can get some nice data about vertical variability in grain size. I'm just going to go through this quickly in the interest of time. We also can slice up these sediment cores and take them to the lab and measure the concentrations of various contaminants that we know are in the Milltown sediments, arsenic, copper, lead, and zinc. See if there's vertical variability, see if there's how the concentrations compare to what we see in the Milltown sediments, and see if there's any way we can make inferences about residence time and so on. And the short story from the freeze coring is that even though we continue to see a lot of fines in the bed for several years after the removal, they were relatively low in concentration of contaminants compared to the Milltown sediments. So this suggested that in conjunction with some tracer studies we were doing out here, that we had a fairly dynamic bed. Each year when these floods came through, the gravel bed was being mobilized, including the fines. Those were moving downstream. And then on the tailing limb, we would have a new deposition. Okay, looking more explicitly at contaminants in bed sediments. So these are samples collected in environments like you see here, mud deposits lateral to the river. We went out and did a set of samples about a month after the dam removal, extending about 60 kilometers downstream. We found very high concentrations of arsenic. And we had stopped at 60 kilometers downstream because we thought we've had hardly any flows yet. We don't need to go further downstream. But for subsequent sampling efforts, we did continue down to Thompson Falls Reservoir. And we saw that although we see a pulse of contaminated sediment right after the removal, it quickly goes back towards background levels in the Clark Fork. And we were getting, so here's a sort of circle showing where these samples are collected. There was certainly some concern about contaminants by the owners of this dam downstream. They didn't want Milltown's problem becoming their problems, but like I said, the concentrations went back to background levels fairly quickly. We can also look at this in terms of copper concentrations over a longer time period, this is just 2008, this is several years, where we'll see spikes of copper concentration, the largest one being in 2008 after the removal, but some smaller ones that are flow-driven in subsequent years, but moving back towards background. Noting that background concentrations of contaminants in the Clark Fork are not pristine. They are higher than a river that has not had the kind of mining history that the Clark Fork does. And there's a lot of cleanup going on, focused on that now. Okay, so just to wrap up about Milltown. Some of the things we saw. The reservoir erosion was far, far greater than was predicted, particularly in the Clark Fork arm of the reservoir, which had implications for how much contaminated sediment was moving out. We also saw a lot of differences in terms of the erosion mechanisms between that confined Blackfoot arm, where the erosion was more about the river just cutting down into its bed, versus the unconfined Clark Fork arm, where the erosion was really lateral and by the river spreading out. Downstream, we didn't see a lot of elevation change, except for in that one depositional reach west of Missoula. The main and persistent downstream response was fine sediment infiltration, which had an ecosystem effect. Anecdotally, anglers said that fishing was poor in the years following the dam removal, probably relates to the effects of that fine sediment on benthic invertebrates, et cetera. And that's not necessarily a contaminant thing. That's just the physical presence of all those fine sediments in the pore spaces. Okay. We didn't have much sedimentation close to the dam. We had a much higher sedimentation rate in areas that we would expect based on geomorphic kind of principles in terms of transport capacity. Fairly rapid reworking of contaminated sediment downstream, despite more contaminants moving into the river than was expected. That 2011 flood that I showed in the graph of the hydrograph, that was a large event that in many ways turned the Clark Fork River into a gravel bed river again. This was the first flood the river had seen in over 100 years, where its upper watershed, its delivery of gravel and wood, et cetera, was connected to the lower river. So some of these shorter-term impacts in terms of fine sediments, et cetera, from Milltown were essentially erased by the Clark Fork. So we see a lot of sort of hydrologically driven effects in terms of the story we saw in the Clark Fork. A lot of it depended on what the flows looked like in the years afterwards. It may have been a different story if we'd had a different sequence of flows. All right. So I'm going to move and talk a few minutes about another dam removal further west. So this is Condit Dam, a tall dam, 38 meters tall. We've got a bit less sediment, but still a substantial volume compared to Milltown. The sediment here is fine compared to any other dam removal, so a large fraction of silt and clay. And this is a tributary to the Columbia. The Condit Dam is in a bedrock gorge about 5 kilometers upstream of the Columbia. This was removed because the dam was up for relicensing. The dam owners had a choice of building a fish ladder or removing the dam, and given its small hydroelectric capacity, the difficulties of building a fish ladder in a bedrock gorge, it was cheaper for them to remove the dam. And the cheapest way to do it, we'll see here. So this is a variant on the blow and go method, where they drill a hole in the base of the dam and then they dynamite it to rapidly drain the reservoir of water and sediment. And by doing that, we create a remarkable geomorphic event downstream, releasing this pulse of sediment that's analogous in many ways to what happens after a volcanic eruption. This is like a hyper-concentrated flow, so we have on the order of a 100-year flood in terms of the amount of water moving downstream, large volumes of sediment. This method, and we'll now look upstream to see what's happening. This is okay, so now we've blown a hole and the reservoir is moving downstream. We've got time-lapse cameras set up on the crest of the dam looking upstream. And we are going to see that because there's all very fine sediment in the reservoir and we have a rapid drawdown rate, we are exposing saturated, steep slopes of sediment in the reservoir, and those are landsliding into the river and turning the river into a hyperconcentrated flow, a mud flow, etc. The shift in the camera was when they allowed me to go back out on the dam crest, because initially they were nervous. There's not, when you blow a hole in the base of the dam, you have to at least account for the possibility that the whole dam might fail. So they were keeping people away, but once they realized that wasn't going to happen, then people could get in and start collecting data downstream. So we see the exposure of a coffer dam, and that was from when the initial dam was constructed. So this method allows the dam owners to remove the rest of the structure in the dry, essentially, over the following year. So the cheapest way of doing this. Okay, so what do we see downstream? Here's the USGS gauge a couple kilometers downstream of the dam. In blue, we can see the spike of water, and that corresponds to about a 100-year flood event. And in black, we see the spike of suspended sediment. And there's a bit of a lag. This is all just a few hours after the dam breach on October 26, 2011. There's a bit of a lag, and if we went back to that video showing the drawdown of the reservoir in the previous video, we could see that lag visually, that the water goes first, the slopes are exposed, and then all the landsliding starts, and the sediment concentrations increase after that. It does return down towards background levels fairly quickly. Visually, we can see what these hyperconcentrated flows look like in samples. So this is immediately after the dam breach, and then we see chocolatey water. We can also look at this in terms of cumulative volumes of sediment and water that have been removed. And this is just on the day of the dam removal. So we're getting about 20% of the total volume of sediment in the reservoir, the total 1.8 million cubic meters getting eroded within a few hours. So a dramatic, rapid response. Here's an aerial image of the reservoir taken the following summer with a time series of photos a little bit further upstream showing the adjustment. And this is a graph showing cumulative reservoir erosion over the roughly 6 months after the dam removal. So things happen rapidly at the beginning and then stabilize. So we've got about 1.2 million cubic meters of that sediment, which is about 60% of the total that gets eroded in short order. After that, they went in and did some revegetation of the slopes to stabilize things and slow things down. Okay, looking downstream, just as with Milltown on the Clark Fork, we can delineate the river into transport and response reaches. So the downstream of Condit Dam, we've got a steep bedrock gorge. And then at the downstreammost point, before it flows into the Columbia, we've got essentially a less confined pool that's influenced by the backwater effect of the Columbia. And we can see longitudinal profiles. The black shows the pre-dam breach. The red shows the post-dam breach. So we see that in this transport reach, as of several, maybe 8 or 9 months after the dam removal, on the riffles, we're back to the pre-dam breach bed elevation. The pools are still filled. But down here, we still see a very persistent major change in geomorphology. Okay, so we can envision what the bedrock gorge looks like here in terms of a series of photos at the USGS gauge. We see a pulse of channel aggradation as bed load is moving through. So the riverbed is raising on the order of a meter or so, but within a couple weeks after the dam removal, we are back to the pre-breach riverbed elevation, and increases in the riverbed stage after that are driven by discharge increases rather than sediment deposition. And so the riffles very rapidly recover and return. The pools, however, get filled with sediment. As bedload, sand, and gravel move through, we get these large, many-meter deep pools within the gorge converted into what essentially are not pools anymore. They're sort of high-velocity runs. We don't know how long this persists, and we don't know what the effect is on salmon that use those pools. We do know that salmon have been moving back upstream through the system. Looking down at that unconfined reach, we can see a more dramatic and persistent change where we see here we have a deeper pool that gets filled with sediment, and we start to see bars reemerge. So we're getting a reach that converts from a pool into more of a pool riffle reach. Okay, and here's what it looks like a little further out. This is a major kayaking river, so about a year after the removal and the dam was finally gone, and kayakers could go downstream through the river, there was a lot of competition to be in those first runs after they opened up the river. And you essentially at the Condit Dam site at this time would not know that a dam had been there. In the reservoir, the only sign really is those marks up on the walls. Okay, so a unique removal method that resulted in reservoir erosion by landsliding and production of mud flows, so many analogies to what happened in rivers after something like the Mount St. Helens eruption. In that confined reach, we see a real differential response between the riffles and the pools. And in the unconfined reach, we see a change to an entirely different type of geomorphology, entirely different type of system. Hydrology really did not have much of an effect on the system here, though. It was really driven by the geomorphology and how steep or confined those different river reaches are. Okay, so in both of these, Milltown and Condit, we've got incredibly rapid reservoir erosion, even at Milltown where the removal method was much slower and more controlled. We see initial but ephemeral fine sediment deposition and rapid recovery of these. And the predominant downstream response is different in these systems, mainly infiltration in Milltown. At Condit, we've got filling of pools and aggradation of that in unconfined reach. In Milltown, we can think of it as a hydrology or flow-driven response. At Condit, the geomorphology is what really drives the recovery and the response of the system. Okay. So putting this in the context of a bunch of recent dam removals and how quickly things happen, we can think about the steepness of the curves here being a measure of how quickly the systems respond. And here's Condit, this red one, which is essentially the fastest, most rapid river response in terms of reservoir sediment erosion as a function of that removal method. Condit's basically done evolving within a few months of the dam removal, whereas some systems are much slower. So putting these together and other dam removals, we now can build sort of an understanding and conceptual models to guide future dam removals in terms of what's going to control the geomorphic response, whether it's the things we have control over in terms of how dams are removed upstream, and factors downstream, including the geomorphology, the grain size of the reservoir deposit versus the river, et cetera. So this has allowed us to start to provide guidance for future dam removals and to think about dam removal geomorphic response in this broader context of how rivers respond to sediment pulses. Okay, so some concluding comments. Large dam removals like those on the Elwha or at Milltown or Condit have geomorphic, ecological, and societal implications that hopefully our science is helping to inform. We can take advantage of these dam removals as an experiment in fluvial geomorphology and river restoration. We know that there is a short-term downstream disturbance from dam removals. What does short-term mean? Is it one life history cycle of a Chinook salmon or of a benthic invertebrate, or is it many years? We don't know that yet. We know that the downstream response, Milltown is somewhat of an exception in terms of hydrology being really important. Most of the dam removals find that geomorphology kind of trumps hydrology in terms of downstream response. Geomorphically, we can say that the impacts are relatively short-term, recovery rates are rapid. We don't have the type of long-term studies, though, to really be able to say what this means for ecosystem recovery, how many fish or other organisms are moving into new habitats, how they're recovering to these short-term responses. We're starting to get there, but the geomorphic studies maybe are able to sort of show that we have rapid recovery rates more easily than the ecosystem studies, which need sort of the decadal scale type studies. And this will continue. You know, there's 85,000 dams or so in the U.S. We've taken out about a third of them. Many of them are aging and will continue filling with sediments. The next big dam removals on the horizon are on the Klamath, 4 large dam removals planned starting in 2021. So I will stop there and take questions. Thanks. Stephanie.
I'm curious about, and maybe get this question a lot further upstream effects from Milltown.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think of Karen Boyd's illustrations showing how the tailings were deposited all along the floodplain. Did you have an opportunity to look at that, or think about that you stated really nicely what the overall effect was on the river?
Yeah. So the upstream effects in Milltown are a little bit confusing in the sense that there's so much management of that area in the Clark Fork upstream. So even areas that were initially available for reservoir erosion, starting in around 2010, they started building a new channel there. And I didn't get into the whole restoration side of things. But because of the presence of continued presence of contaminants, that was a situation where active management of the reservoir beyond just the sediment excavation happened. So a lot of the Milltown upstream story is tied into the river restoration. There's a new reach there that's been constructed by humans there, and you drive through and it's starting to have riparian vegetation emerge. When they routed the channel into its new channel, it got hit by the 2011 flood fairly quickly. There wasn't a lot of vegetation yet, so the managers were holding their fingers to see if it would unravel or not, and it held up reasonably well, given how long duration that 2011 flood event was. So in terms of sort of the other main upstream impact that people think about in Milltown and then other dam removals is groundwater. So you drop the base level, you're going to affect people's wells potentially. So a lot of money went into drilling new wells in Milltown. At Condit, people's groundwater wells were dried up as well, who had houses on the border of the reservoir. In Milltown, they actually found that the groundwater drawdown was not as much as had been predicted, and not totally understood why. A guy named Tony Bertolot did his PhD dissertation on this, working with Bill Wisner. But there's a lot of fractured bedrock around there, and a lot of uncertainties about how groundwater flow moves through fractured bedrock in an environment like that, and how that groundwater flow interacts with sort of the river hyporheic groundwater flow in the valleys. Here.
I think very much related to that. I just want to drill down a little bit on the restoration actions that were taken in the constructed channel. My observation of that at the time was it's pretty heavy-handed lateral and vertical stabilization controls.
Mm-hmm.
Have you spent enough time out? Was that within the site you're looking at? And through that 2011 flood, did those controls prove necessary, or did they get buried? Can you just fill me in on your observations related to those grade controls, lateral and vertical?
Yeah. So, Peter's question gets at kind of a question with dam removal and with river restoration in general is, to what extent do you let the river evolve in the way that the river will based on its own processes versus guiding things using grade control on the bed of the river, which is going to limit how much it can cut down, and that's generally putting boulders in the bed of the river, or a lateral control like large woody debris in the banks of the river. And there's always a choice in river restoration in terms of how much, what the human hand is going to be. So here's an image of the Milltown restoration. So it's a single thread channel with some side channels that can be activated at high flow. And this is, on the end of the sort of let the river do its own thing versus build in some controls. This is definitely a controlled reach. It's designed to look natural, but there's grade control on the bed and lateral control on the banks. When it got hit by the 2011 flood, there were several reaches where the river jumped out of its constructed channel and essentially cut across these bars, so we can consider those chute cutoffs or avulsions. And in one case, they moved it back to the original channel after the flows went down. In another case, they let the avulsion be. And there's been a lot of controversy over, this restoration in general, in terms of, what was the best approach. Do I have a crystal ball, and can I say, if we had just let the river evolve its own channel, what would it look like compared to what it looks like now? It would be a more multi-thread system, which we did some analysis to suggest that is what you would have expected historically in this site. So a lot of rivers in Montana are sort of transitional between single thread and braided. We can call them wandering rivers. And that's probably what would have evolved here. This is in a site where there are some contaminants remaining, though. And so you can understand why there would have been a desire to have some more control over it, even though that was not necessarily sort of discussed as a primary reason for doing it the way they did it. I mean, this is how a lot of river restorations look, regardless of contaminants, geomorphic setting, et cetera. But it probably did, help in terms of limiting the amount of reservoir erosion and potential unraveling of that system in the 2011 event, that they had the channel in this constructed channel by that time. Rob?
Presumably the first depositional location downstream from the dam would be an area that would have received a lot more sediment over the years if the dam had never been built. What are your thoughts on the resulting geomorphic structure that you get after a single event dropping all that sediment versus what would have been there if the dam wasn't built?
Well, the Clark Fork is actually a relatively low sediment supply system. So constructing Milltown Dam certainly had some, in terms of cutting off sediment supply, certainly had some downstream effect in terms of making the bed more armored and things like this. But in terms of sort of gross geomorphic changes of having less deposition down in that reach, probably not as significant as if you had a dam that was cutting off sediment supply in a more sediment-rich type system. That reach, we saw a lot of deposition in 2008, and we saw a lot of reworking in the subsequent years. So it's a very dynamic reach, and having the sediment back in there, I think, increased sort of the dynamism of it in terms of, you know, we talk about avulsions here and multi-thread channels. That's a great example of a multi-thread wandering river where the channel's shifting around, depositing in side channels, filling up side channels. So bringing the sediment back to there may have kind of increased the dynamism a little bit. And we've got some students that are working on trying to understand that using aerial photo analysis over time and so on. I've got a senior thesis on that right now, trying to understand sort of the post-Milltown changes in the context of longer-term changes down there. I know it's 1 and many people probably need to go, so I won't be offended, but happy to continue taking questions.
Andrew, you showed this lovely image of the repeat LiDAR showing change in topography for Reservoir.
Yep.
And I was wondering, well, and you mentioned that all of the models predicted that there wouldn't be this change, but there was change. And I was wondering what models, like, why would they predict there wasn't change? And is it because all of this happened in the 2015 event?
Yeah. This points to...
2011, sorry.
So in terms of modeling of river processes, flow and sediment transport, there are well-established one-dimensional models which can simulate vertical change in a river, so how much a river is going to cut down into its bed if you change the base level, so the downstream control. So that type of model will work reasonably well in a confined system where the geomorphic response is going to be down cutting. And it did in this case. The predictions from this HEC 6 model were not bad for the lower Blackfoot. Modeling an unconfined system where it's more of a two-dimensional problem is a much more challenging thing to do. And a one-dimensional model was used here. That's what they did. Two-dimensional models are more difficult to use, and even those have uncertainties, but it's more of a two-dimensional problem where you have lateral erosion. So that's a big reason that this kind of prediction ends up so low, is because it essentially is just predicting the vertical incision. And because you're already fairly far upstream because of all this remediation here, the response to the base level down here is not that great up here. So a two-dimensional model would have been more appropriate. And we can say now from this and other dam removals that if you're removing a dam in an unconfined reach of river, you should use a two-dimensional model to try and predict the reservoir erosion. If you're removing a dam in a confined reach, like the Blackfoot, then a one-dimensional model is probably fine.
Do they have multiple repeats? So sort of before the 2011 flood and after? I guess I was wondering, you saw the
of the LiDAR
pulses of sediment flux immediately after, and then with the sort of hydrograph changes. And do you have an idea of whether these LiDAR changes correspond with initial event or with sort of hydrographic changes later?
Right. Yes, there are multiple LiDAR data sets, and they tell a similar story as this, in terms of the initial response was most of the action was in 2008. And in 2011, there's a lot of suspended sediment flux coming into the, and bed load flux coming in and out, meaning that the erosion is surprisingly small, even though that's a big event in 2011. And the repeat LiDARs, we have one from after 2011, and that bears that out as well.
Oh, sorry, I missed the fact that that was 2000.
Yeah, this is just one of the sort of LiDAR comparisons when most of the action happens. Yeah, Anna.
So I know this isn't necessarily your specialty, but considering the Clark Fork River is so heavily recreated and it contains arsenic, finding that in sediment for a while, how well do you feel like your research and other research on the river was communicated to the public?
Well,
or generally around some of these dams?
Yeah, this was an interesting kind of learning experience for me in terms of working with the media. And we talked to reporters and communicated what we were finding in the aftermath in that summer of 2008. Communicated that hey, there's a lot of sediment down in the river and some of it's contaminated. And we got some pushback from agencies that went out and collected some data that they felt told a different story in terms of contaminants. And I think that a lot of what sort of came out in the story was just about the contaminants. You know, I'm a geomorphologist. I was interested in like, hey, the river's changing, there's all this sediment, and isn't this neat? But when it gets communicated to the public, it's arsenic. You know, it gets boiled down to something really simple. And is it safe to recreate in the river? And that didn't necessarily come out in the initial, stories from the newspaper. And I actually eventually, wrote a letter to the editor saying, hey, I and my students are working in the river all the time. We feel it's safe. And there's a geomorphology story here and a contaminant story here. And they're connected to some extent, but they're also different in some ways. And, recognizing that there has been some contaminated sediment that has moved out of the reservoir and gone downstream is not the same as saying this is an environmental catastrophe and we should not go near the river. There's a lot of gray area in science, and that was challenging to convey and communicate through the medium of newspapers. Yeah.
I have to shut the system down, I'm sorry.
Okay.
It just doesn't.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.